Welcome back to the Noir Archive. Today, we open a secret archive from the closing days of World War II. As the Reich crumbled, a shadow rose from the ruins. This is the dark history of Operation Werewolf, Hitler's final, desperate guerrilla unit and the secret operation that was meant to burn Europe to the ground. March 1945. Germany was no longer an empire, but a massive graveyard stretching from the Rhine to the very gates of Berlin. The cities that were once the pride of Central European civilization were now merely dry skeletons of brick and stone, stained by black smoke from the destructive bombing raids of the Allied air forces. The world at that time believed the fascist monster was drawing its last breath. American, British, and Soviet Red Army soldiers began to think about the day they would return home, about a peace that would soon be established over the ruins. But, in the darkest and deepest underground bunkers, a new fear was being nurtured. It did not take the form of the once illustrious panzer armored divisions, nor the Luftwaffe squadrons that dominated the skies. It bore the name, Werewolf, the werewolf. All means are permitted to inflict damage upon the enemy, the hoarse voice of Joseph Goebbels echoed through old radios, cutting through the static radio waves. Every house, every alley, every bush will become a fortress. The enemy will not have a single moment of peace on this land. This was not a regular army. This was a secret guerrilla network, trained to assassinate, sabotage, and sow terror right behind the front lines of the occupying forces. Those who swore never to surrender, those who chose death in the shadows over the humiliation of the defeated. But what was the truth behind Operation Werewolf? A brilliant military plan to turn the tide, or just the final sleepwalking of mad minds in a dying empire? Welcome to the Noir Archive. Today, we will reopen the forgotten secret files to face Hitler's last werewolves. To understand Operation Werewolf, we must travel back in time to the fall of 1944. At that time, Germany's Western Wall, had been breached. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the architect of fear, realized that the regular army no longer had the strength to stop the Allied wave. He needed something different, a people's war, but in the most brutal way. The name Werewolf did not come about by chance. It was inspired by Hermann Lanza's novel about German peasants organizing themselves into resistance groups against invaders during the 30 Years' War. Himmler wanted to recreate that spirit, but coated it in a dark layer of Nazi ideology. On March 23, 1945, a secret radio station named Radio Werewolf began broadcasting. Its theme tune was a chilling wolf howl mixed with marching drums. Goebbels, the master of lies, used the most extreme rhetoric to call upon the German people to take up arms. He declared that anyone who cooperated with the Allies was a traitor and would be punished by the Werewolf court. The terror was not only reserved for the external enemy, but was also a knife pressed against the throats of the German people themselves. The werewolf was built up as a ghost lurking in every forest, every basement, ready to strike down anyone intending to raise a white flag of surrender. In the cold corridors of Schloss Herzberg, an ancient castle requisitioned as a training center, Heinrich Himmler, together with Hans Adolf Prutzmann, an SS general with extensive experience in genocide on the Eastern Front, outlined the structure of the werewolf. Prutzmann did not want an army parading on the streets, he wanted independent cells. Each werewolf unit consisted of only 3 to 6 members, operating completely independently so that if one person was caught, the entire network would not collapse. This is the mindset of a modern terrorist organization, applied in the final stages of World War II. They did not wear uniforms, they did not carry dog tags. They were ghosts blending into the streams of refugees, gentle peasants by day who wielded daggers and garrots by night. When the most elite SS divisions had been crushed at Stalingrad and Normandy, Himmler turned to the final resource, the children. This is the darkest aspect of Operation Werewolf. Teenagers belonging to the Hitler Youth Organization, some only 14 or 15 years old, had been brainwashed by a decade of propaganda. For these children, Hitler was not just a leader, but a god. They were taught that dying for the nation was the highest, most noble glory. At the crash course training camps, they did not learn math or literature, they learned how to lay booby traps, how to use sniper rifles to target Allied officers, and how to use cyanide capsules to commit suicide if they fell into enemy hands. Imagine an atmosphere thick with fanaticism, teenagers standing under flickering torchlight in dense forests, swearing a deadly oath before the wolf's angel, wolf hook, symbol. That was not the oath of soldiers defending their homeland, but the oath of martyrs in an extremist cult. The werewolf's oath left no room for leniency. Once joined, the only way out was death. Goebbels directly drafted the ironclad messages broadcast on Radio Werewolf: any mayor who hangs a white flag, any citizen who provides food to the Americans, is a target of the werewolf. This was a two-faced psychological warfare campaign. On one hand, it sowed paranoia among the Allies, making them wary of every street corner. On the administrative hand, it chained the German people to the collapsing war machine. The werewolves' courts of honor were set up in a flash during the night. They would sneak into the homes of those intending to surrender, leaving a piece of paper with a drawing of a wolf's head and a single sentence, "We are watching you." Often, the victim would then be hanged right from a tree in front of their house as a warning to the entire village. Despite being heavily advertised, the truth behind Operation Werewolf was a chaotic mess of shortages. Himmler had ordered the construction of thousands of secret underground bunkers across Germany, filled with weapons, explosives, and dry rations. However, in the chaos of the final days of the war, many of these bunkers were abandoned or looted for food by starving locals. The werewolves often had to make do with what they had: explosives taken from unexploded Allied bombs, or antiquated rifles from World War I. But it was precisely this crudeness that made them dangerous. A steel wire stretched across the road was enough to take the life of an American Jeep driver. A poisoned loaf of bread left in the kitchen of an abandoned house was enough to wipe out a patrol squad. In March 1945, Aachen, the historic city of German emperors, was now just a massive pile of rubble under the control of the U.S. First Army. This was the first major German city to fall. On roads covered in white snow and mud, American soldiers patrolled with high vigilance. They thought they had mastered this land, but they did not know that, from the gloomy forests outside the city, the eyes of the werewolf were watching their every move through the scopes of sniper rifles. Aachen was not just a military target, it was a symbol. For Hitler and Himmler, Aachen's surrender was an unforgivable disgrace. And the man at the top of the Third Reich's must-die list at that time was Franz Oppenhoff. Franz Oppenhoff was a virtuous Catholic lawyer, a man who had secretly held anti-fascist views for a long time. When the American troops entered Aachen, they needed a reputable figure to rebuild the city from the ashes. Oppenhoff accepted the position of mayor under Allied control. For the starving people of Aachen, he was hope. But for Berlin, he was a demon, a traitor to the Aryan bloodline. Heinrich Himmler personally gave the order: Oppenhoff must be eliminated to make an example. A death sentence was pronounced in absentia at a secret court-martial in Berlin. And to carry out the sentence, an insane plan codenamed Operation Carnival, Unternehmen Carnival, was approved. The special task force selected for this mission was a bizarre combination: two seasoned SS officers, Herbert Wenzel and Werner Heidermann, a female operative intimately familiar with the local terrain, Ilse Hirsch, and a 16-year-old Hitler youth named Erich Morgenschweiss. They represented all the demographics that Operation Werewolf wanted to mold. On the night of March 20, 1945, an American B-17 bomber, but actually war booty, captured by the Germans and repainted, glided through the pitch-black darkness of the Rhineland sky. The roaring engine noise drowned out the heartbeats of the assassins. They parachuted into a dense, snow-covered forest a few miles from Aachen. The infiltration journey was a nightmare of endurance. They had to cross American minefields, hiding in abandoned trenches when the headlights of jeeps swept across the road. The snow fell so thickly that it obscured their vision, but Ilse Hirsch, who had been a local Nazi Girls League leader, guided them through shortcuts that only locals would know. They headed toward the villa at 251 Upiner Street, where Oppenhoff was living with his family. On the night of March 25, the air in Aachen was freezing cold. The city was under a strict curfew. Inside the villa, Franz Oppenhoff had just finished a tiring day of work. He had no idea that, outside the window, dark shadows were closing in. Wenzel and Heidermann approached the back door, while the others stood guard. They knocked on the door. When the maid opened it, they claimed to be downed German pilots trying to find their way back to their lines. It was a perfect lie designed to strike at the compassion of those of the same blood. Oppenhoff stepped out into the hallway. He faced two strange men in clothes smeared with mud and snow. Wenzel started the conversation calmly, even politely. But then, the rhythm of events changed abruptly in a fraction of a second. Wenzel pulled out a pistol fitted with a silencer. Oppenhoff was stunned. No plea could be uttered in time. A dry gunshot rang out. The bullet embedded straight into the mayor's temple. He collapsed onto the floor, blood spreading across the cold tiles. The assassins did not hesitate at all. They retreated immediately into the night. During the escape, Ilse Hirsch stepped on a booby-trap mine and was severely injured, but Heidermann dragged her away. They vanished into the ruins of Aachen before the American soldiers could react. The next morning, news of Oppenhoff's death spread like wildfire. The US military was stunned. This was not a conventional military action, this was a message. A heavily guarded mayor right in the heart of an occupied city had been assassinated with ease. Paranoia began to envelop the Allied forces. American soldiers looked at every German civilian with suspicious eyes. They realized that, the enemy was not just in front of them on the front line, but also right behind their backs, in the darkness of the alleys, beneath the scarves of women, and behind the innocence of children. The Aachen assassination achieved Goebbels' goal. It turned the werewolf from a radio myth into a tangible, flesh and blood threat. US intelligence reports began to be flooded with phrases like the Ghost Army or hidden assassins. American soldiers began to apply more extreme measures, 24/7 curfews, searching every house, taking hostages en masse. But it was exactly these harsh reactions that inadvertently pushed the German people towards extremism, creating a vortex of violence and fear that the werewolf craved. Why was Operation Carnival successful? It was because it took advantage of the Allies' complacency and the utmost fanaticism of the SS operatives. Wenzel and his team had no intention of returning safely, they accepted this as a suicide mission. The combination of elite military skills and Ilse Hirsch's local knowledge created an unfillable loophole in the American security system. Furthermore, Oppenhoff's death extinguished the willingness to collaborate among many other German officials. Those who intended to step up and work for the Allies now faced a brutal choice: die at the hands of the werewolf right now, or wait for punishment from the Allies later. The majority chose silence. As the Allied forces advanced deep into German territory, they not only faced the barrels of artillery guns but also stepped into a labyrinth of betrayal. The vast Black Forest, which was the inspiration for the grim fairy tales, now became a graveyard for American and Soviet patrols. Beneath the rotting leaves and melting snow lay a meticulously camouflaged secret network of underground bunkers. These were not solid steel fortresses, but cramped, damp, dark holes where the werewolves hid like wild beasts. Each bunker was a small armory, from stray ammunition boxes to bags of plastic explosives stolen from destroyed structures. Here, in the flickering candlelight, the most ruthless plans were drawn up. Due to a shortage of regular weapons, the werewolf turned creativity into a ruthless killing tool. They did not need tiger tanks to destroy the enemy. One of the simplest yet most haunting traps was the death wire. Taking advantage of the fact that American soldiers often drove jeeps with the windshields down to increase visibility, werewolf members would stretch a thin but extremely strong steel wire across the road at neck height. In the dead of night or in the fog, vehicles sped by at high speeds, and the result was an irredeemable horror for the unfortunate soldiers. It created such psychological panic that the US military later had to weld a vertical iron bar to the front of their jeeps just to cut these death wires. But the cruelty did not stop there. Poison became a primary weapon. Cyanide capsules were not only meant for suicide upon capture, but were also used to poison food. The werewolf would intentionally leave behind expensive bottles of wine and seemingly delicious packaged meat in abandoned houses. Allied soldiers, after days of hungry and thirsty marching, easily fell into the trap. The result was not a victory on the battlefield, but silent, painful deaths in convulsions right at the dining table. The most heartbreaking aspect of the entire Operation Werewolf was turning children into tools of war. The children belonging to the Hitler Youth, some only 12 or 13 years old, had their souls stripped away by the fascist education system. They were taught that the outside world was the devil and Hitler was the only father. When American soldiers entered a village, they often let their guard down around the children. They shared candy and cookies with them. But behind those smudged faces were well-trained assassins. These children were tasked with hiding behind shattered window frames or on steep rooftops, holding heavy Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons, or sniper rifles in their hands. There are historical reports recording scenes of an American soldier being shot down by a precise bullet from a young boy wearing shorts and short socks. When American soldiers rushed into the house, they did not see a single German soldier, only a child crying and pretending to be afraid. This fake innocence was the werewolf's most dangerous weapon, because it broke all the moral codes of the Allied soldiers, forcing them to make grim decisions, either shoot a child, or let themselves be killed. The organizational method of the werewolf in this chapter emerges like a historical ghost. Himmler had ordered the construction of underground weapon caches camouflaged as piles of firewood or fake graves in cemeteries. Each werewolf unit operated on the cell principle, with no direct contact with superiors to avoid exposing the entire system. They used codes hidden in local newspapers or light signals on hilltops. This secrecy drove Allied intelligence, OSS and NKVD, crazy. They could not distinguish between a regular civilian trying to survive and a werewolf member waiting for the opportunity to place a mine under a general's vehicle. The werewolf were not only the enemies of the Allies, they were also a nightmare for the German people themselves. In the final stages of the war, many German people were exhausted. They wanted to hang white flags of surrender to save their families and villages from being leveled by Allied artillery. But for the werewolf, surrendering was a capital crime. On dark nights, squads of werewolves would break into the homes of those suspected of defeatism. They did not need a trial. A rope tossed over a beam, a gunshot to the back of the neck, or more horrifyingly, using a dagger to carve a swastika symbol onto the victim's chest. In the city of Penzberg, right before American troops entered, a werewolf group executed 16 civilians including pregnant women just because they wanted to prevent the futile resistance of the German army to save the city. This brutality showed the true nature of the werewolf. It was not a force to protect the people, but an instrument of ultimate destruction. As the empire collapsed, they wanted to drag the entire nation down to the grave with them. Names like Nightwolves or People's Justice became the most terrifying obsession for German mothers trying to shield their children in the shelters. Amidst the gloomy Black Forest, sporadic gunfire still rang out even though Berlin had almost collapsed. Hitler Youth children sat in dark bunkers, tightly gripping cyanide pills in their hands, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. They no longer knew what they were fighting for, only knowing that the world had ended and the werewolf was all they had left. The Allies began to realize a bitter truth: defeating the regular German army was hard enough, but cleansing the toxicity of the werewolf ideology from the minds of a traumatized generation of children was 10,000 times harder. This unconventional war not only left corpses on the streets but also left permanent scars on the conscience of an entire nation. In the latter half of April 1945, the skies over Germany were obscured by the ash of burning cities. On the ground, convoys of American armored vehicles and Soviet T-34 tanks roared toward Berlin. However, behind the halo of victory lay an agonizing reality. Sporadic assassinations, steel wires stretched across roads, and doses of poison in food had pushed the patience of Allied commanders to their extreme limits. At temporary bases and newly occupied villages, the Allies no longer considered the German people as victims needing liberation. They looked at everyone through the lens of suspicion. A ruthless martial law decree was issued. Any act of unconventional resistance would be met with immediate death. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Soviet commanders agreed on one viewpoint: the werewolves were not soldiers, they were criminals without uniforms. According to the Hague Conventions, combatants without uniforms were not entitled to prisoner of war status. This opened a bloody chapter in post-war history. In American-controlled areas, military police, MP, and Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, units began devastating sweep operations. If an American soldier was sniped from a house, all the men in that house, sometimes the entire neighborhood, would be dragged out into the street for interrogation. The image of hostages taken and lined up in front of machine gun barrels became common. In the East, the Soviet Red Army reacted even more fiercely. With memories of Nazi brutality on Russian soil, they showed no mercy toward any sign of the werewolf. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were leveled by artillery. On-the-spot executions took place publicly to serve as a deterrent. The Allied message was very clear: if you choose to fight like beasts in the dark, we will hunt you down like wild beasts. The werewolf fear created a heavy atmosphere of paranoia within the Allied ranks, a psychological syndrome that historians call werewolf phobia. A 19-year-old American soldier from Kansas, who had never left his farm, now had to face a reality where a gentle old man could hide a dagger under his coat, or a beautiful young woman could put arsenic into a cup of coffee she offered him. Trust no one became a slogan of survival. This paranoia led to heartbreaking tragedies of mistaken identity. Allied guards often opened fire on any dark shadow moving in the night without warning. German civilians fetching water late at night or lost children could all become victims of gun barrels trembling with fear. The trust between the occupier and the occupied was completely shattered, replaced instead by a deadly silence that enveloped the area whenever the troops passed through. While Goebbels' propaganda still boasted about a mighty ghost army, the reality inside the werewolf bunkers was a miserable collapse. Operation Werewolf was designed based on an illusion of sustainable resupply, but when Germany's traffic arteries were severed, the werewolves became starving wretches. The secret bunkers became damp graves. Explosives were ruined by moisture, guns jammed due to a lack of maintenance oil, and most importantly, communications were completely paralyzed. The small, isolated guerrilla squads did not know what was happening in the outside world. They did not know whether Berlin had fallen or not, they just waited for an order that would never come from leaders who had committed suicide in the Reichstag bunker. The food shortage forced werewolf members to risk going out to loot from their own people, eroding whatever little support was left. The army that Himmler dreamed of was now just ragged groups of people, their morale broken and isolated in the middle of a country too exhausted by war. As death and starvation drew near, blind loyalty began to crack. Betrayal was the final, fatal blow that finished off Operation Werewolf. Seasoned SS soldiers, those who had once sworn blood oaths under torchlight, now began to consider a way to survive. In exchange for leniency or a meal from American soldiers, many werewolf members surrendered and revealed the locations of their comrades, weapons caches, and the identities of their leaders. At CIC interrogation camps, the once proud werewolves now bowed their heads and pointed fingers for the enemy. The most tragic of all was the fate of the Hitler Youth children. Abandoned by their superiors, many of them were murdered by their own SS teachers to silence them, or were left to die in underground bunkers with no way out. The betrayal was not just a betrayal of ideals, but a betrayal of their own people and those sharing the front lines. By the end of May 1945, Operation Werewolf had essentially been broken. Not by major battles, but by spiritual exhaustion and the uncompromising ruthlessness of anti-guerrilla measures. The wolves that once sowed terror were now just ragged ghosts, lurking in history as a painful scar of a feudal resistance. When the final gunshots fell silent on the battlefields of Europe, Germany entered a new era of division and reconstruction. The werewolf bunkers were gradually filled with dirt and rocks, and the files about them were sealed away in the archives of the CIA and KGB. However, the question remains, was the werewolf truly a mighty resistance army or just an illusion woven from madness? Looking back at history objectively, modern historians conclude that Operation Werewolf failed militarily but succeeded in terms of psychological warfare. It never reached the scale of a widespread guerrilla war like in France or Vietnam. The majority of the attacks were spontaneous, lacked coordination, and were quickly extinguished. But, it was the exaggeration by both sides that nourished this myth. Goebbels needed it to maintain false hope for a collapsing nation, while the Allies used it to justify their harsh occupation measures. The werewolf was not an army, but a psychological ghost, an invisible fear more effective than any remaining armored division. The masterminds behind Operation Werewolf never had to face justice at Nuremberg. Joseph Goebbels committed suicide in the Reichstag bunker after poisoning his own children. Heinrich Himmler was captured by British soldiers while trying to flee under a false identity, but quickly ended his own life with a cyanide capsule hidden between his teeth. They took the secrets of the werewolf network to their graves, leaving the Hitler Youth children abandoned in a world with no place for them. The greatest legacy that the werewolf left behind was not military exploits, but a chilling warning about the power of extremism. It shows that when an ideology is pushed into a corner, it is ready to sacrifice its own future, its children, to serve ultimate destruction. Operation Werewolf is proof that blind loyalty can turn ordinary people into ruthless assassins, and turn a nation into the victims of their own beliefs. The files on Operation Werewolf are closed, but the scars it left behind still remain in the memories of the American soldiers who had to be wary of every tree trunk, and in the obsession of the German civilians who were once hunted by their own family members. History is not only written by glorious victories, but also by the coldest, darkest corners of humanity. And perhaps, the greatest lesson from the final werewolves of the Third Reich is, in war, the most terrifying monster is not the enemy in front of you, but the darkness devouring the human soul from within.